Okay.
So I am here. Welcome, readers of the Free Christians Books and More readers group. And I am here to introduce my father, the next author that we have with us. His name is Peter Rodgers, and he has a book coming out called The Pelican and the Phoenix, and it has just been released. And I had the privilege of being able to read and help edit this book, and I was just delighted to be able to have a hand in putting this novel out there because it is so delightful, so uh, it, um, ju- just really tells us about the heart of God for Christians who are in the middle of persecution, and and also about the heart of God for the scriptures and what the scriptures are to mean to us. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my dad, Peter Rodgers.
Thank you,
Hi,
Sarah.
Dad.
And hi, how are you? Thank you. And I'm glad to have a few minutes to give a little plug to this book. It is actually the third book in a series called The Scribes, which illustrates the fortunes and misfortunes of the life and experiences of early Christians around the end of the second century, 180 to 190, who sought faithfully to copy the scriptures that their churches had received, and all the kind of problems that go into that, because before printed a movable type, any books you had to copy off by hand, an arduous process where it was easy to make mistakes unless you were very careful. And the series illustrates the kind of things that happened in the course of copying those scriptures in the world in which they lived.
And I'm wondering if, Dad, you can tell us more about that world. So you've spent a great deal of time studying this second century, and tell us first of all what drew you into that particular study.
Well, I've long been fascinated with um, the variations that you find in the Greek New Testament. If you read any study Bible, you will see that there are footnotes that say other ancient authorities or other manuscripts read this or that. And I say, well, where did this come from? And is there any value to this particular reading? And how did it get there? Was something left out? Was something added on? And so anybody who studies it is technically known as textual criticism, and that's what I've been involved in. And I thought it's a very technical discipline, and mostly just engaged in by the specialists. And I thought, is there some way in which we can make all the different treasures and interesting things about this study available to the non-specialist reader? And I stumbled on this idea of the Scribes novels. And one of my scholar friends said, I can't imagine how you would make a novel out of textual criticism. And I said, have a look. So that's where we are. And the first novel, quickly, is a trip around the Mediterranean basin, visiting all the churches and the differences between the way the Roman church read things and the way the Alexandrian church read things. The second is a trip to Gaul and Britain with two different and discernibly different texts of the Acts of the Apostles. And the third, that is the B text and the D text, but I won't go any further on that. And the third has to do primarily with North Africa and the development of the early Latin text. There's a European one and there's an African one, and there are differences.
Wow,
So
that's very fascinating.
technical
Because so many of us don't realize that there was a Latin text before Jerome
Oh
sat
yeah,
down and translated.
there were, in fact, when Jerome sat down to translate the Vulgate, he said, "Well, there are as many different Latin texts as there are people who have copies." And so
Wow.
he tried to bring the confusion into some order. He didn't want to do it because he knew everybody would be mad at him because he destroyed their wonderful text, but he did it anyway. And that was in the late 300s, the end of the fourth century. But my scribes lived in the end of the second century. And one of the reasons that I chose that era is that this is the first point at which we have some rather large pieces of the New Testament that are from that era.
Wow.
The manuscripts that go back P66, the Gospel of John, P75, a copy fragmentary of Luke and John, and P46, which is a copy of the letters of Paul.
And where were those found?
They were found in Egypt, in the dry sands of Egypt,
That is
where they were
fascinating.
preserved from falling apart. They're papyrus, paper goods, but they were preserved in the dry sands, and they have been discovered in this century.
Wow. That
Yeah,
is so fascinating. And that
and
just gives more credibility to what was originally written because it was so close to the time of when it was written.
the other thing that fascinates me is that the text you have in P75, which was written around 180 or 200, that's the text that you also find in a manuscript 200 years later, Codex Vaticanus, which is
Wow.
generally agreed to be one of our most faithfully copied and closest to the original manuscripts that we have. It lives in the Vatican Library in Rome, and it's a famous manuscript of the New Testament.
That is amazing.
So,
And one of the other aspects of your novel is the aspect of persecution. And can you explain to us how persecution was happening in conjunction with the copying of the scriptures?
well, Christians who could read, and there are only about 10% of the population of the Greco-Roman Empire who could,
Yes.
those who could read and write faithfully copied their scriptures. But in the early church before Constantine, there were periodic persecutions of the church. Toward the end of the second century, there were several, both local and more widespread. But one particular local persecution which caught my eye was happened in a little village called Silium near Carthage in 180 AD, and where 12 Christians were rounded up. And one of the things that they questioned them about was what they had in the books. And the man said, well, these are the books of Paul, a righteous man. This is the very earliest evidence we have of Latin Christianity.
Wow.
And in fact, it's a background to the tale I tell in Pelican and the Phoenix, because the people in 187, 88 in Carthage knew these Sicilian martyrs. And in fact, Tertullian, who is an early Christian writer, some of you will know his name, he was one of the great Christian writers. He was drawn to Christian faith because of the faithfulness of the Christians under trial, and particularly the Sicilian martyrs. So that all comes in a way into the tale I tell.
Wow.
But when Christians were persecuted, often their books were rounded up. They were required to give up their books, and the books were destroyed or burned or something.
Oh, yes.
And that's, of course, devastating because it takes such a long time to copy and to copy faithfully a copy of the scriptures, both Old and New Testament.
And so they had much of the scripture memorized. Is that right?
This is the other thing that I try and bring out in the script, in the novels, all three of them really, but particularly in this volume, that the people had great reams of the scripture memorized. If it seems fantastical to us today, it shouldn't. I mean, it's interesting to see that many Muslim kids will memorize the whole of the Quran. And then they have, I know in Egypt, they have a yearly contest for the person who is the best singer of the Quran, singing it all the way through. Well, this is the way the Christians behaved, that they knew their scriptures. Many people couldn't read, and they were taught them or had them read to them, and they memorized them off by heart. And for instance, Psalms, which are regularly used in worship in the early church, people would know all the Psalms off by heart. And bishop in Alexandria in the early church, you had to know all the Psalms off by heart in Greek.
Wow.
Imagine what that would do for the church if we required our church leaders to know all the Psalms. We'll let them know them in English, okay? But so that's another thing that. And when our friend Rufus from Rome meets a friend from Carthage, they both know the scriptures. And
And
so
this is in
even,
the Pelican and the Phoenix.
yes, in the Pelican and the Phoenix, Rufus is the main character, Pelican, one of the two main characters. And he and his friends from Carthage can argue about the little differences in the scriptures because they both know their scriptures off by heart.
Wow. Well, we can talk about this for hours. I know
Well,
that you and I could very easily.
yeah.
And but I just wanted to go ahead and give the readers a flavor of what it is that your heart is in telling this story. And
I think it's important for us to emphasize that if you know nothing about the technical side of this and don't know or even care too much about that, I tried to make it a cracking good read, whether you know anything about it or not.
and it is. I do know quite a bit, but I've shared some with people who don't know much, and they have found it to be very readable.
And emphasize in the last that in the end, I think, this whole study of the text and of the differences has brought me to a greater confidence in the trustworthiness and reliability of the scripture as we have it.
And that is a wonderful thing indeed.
Yeah.
And so I am blessed to have some of that knowledge passed on to me as well. So
Sarah, thank you so much for letting me talk on a bit about this little project. And I'm in the process in the next 5 years or so of putting together the last volume in the series called The Star of the East. So more about that further down the road.
wonderful. Well, I look forward to reading that, and I'm sure that's the readers here in the group will look forward to seeing the release of that book as well. And we thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.